Ladies and gentlemen, if you could take your seats, please, we're going to get started. Good morning. My name is Frank Gaffney. I'm wearing several hats today. I'm the president of an organization, executive chairman of an organization called the Center for Security Policy. I am also the president and CEO of a new organization called Save the Persecuted Christians, but I'm here in a different capacity today as the vice chairman of this new organization, the Committee on the Present Danger, China. I wanted to say just a few words of introduction to the program today. Before, let me say thank you to all of you who are here, and thank you to those of you who are now taking part in this important program via live streaming, and also, of course, those of you who will be getting information about this through other members of the media who are here, I'm very pleased to say, in force. I want to say a word of thanks in sort of general to the terrific team of speakers that we have pulled together for you. Many of them have come from some distance, and they're going to make it worth your while, I'm quite confident, in the course of this concentrated program. It will be a series of relatively brief remarks, and then we will do some question and answer for any one of them as you wish. Let me just set the stage for it by saying a few words about the Committee on the Present Danger. For those of you who have as much gray hair as I do, you may remember the previous incarnations of this group. It came together initially in the 50s, and then again, particularly consequentially, in the 1970s. There was a subsequent effort made in the post-9/11 period. But I want to say just a word about the middle of those three groupings. It was at a time when the Soviet Union, a communist totalitarian power, explicitly seeking the destruction of this country, was on the march. And a man by the name of Ronald Reagan was determined to stop them. In the 1970s, of course, he was no longer the governor of California, and he was not yet the president of the United States, but he saw very clearly the present danger that China represented, and he became a member of a group of national security experts, business leaders, subject matter specialists, activists, and others who were similarly minded about the importance of countering what the Soviet Union was doing vis-a-vis the United States and around the world. This group actually helped develop, I think it's fair to say, Reagan's thinking, certainly his strategy for defeating the Soviet Union, which became a centerpiece of his platform in his campaign for the presidency in 1980. He subsequently tapped some of his fellow members of the Committee on the Present Danger to help him execute the strategy that they devised for not simply containing or countering the Kremlin, but actually defeating the USSR. I'm very pleased, and I'll say a bit more about him in a moment, that one of our speakers is Roger Robinson, who helped President Reagan execute that strategy as a senior member of the National Security Council. The point of all of this is simply to say, we believe that the United States faces a similar, indeed a much more dangerous, totalitarian communist regime, led by the Chinese Communist Party, presided over at the moment by Xi Jinping, but an entity that has for decades actually been at war with the United States. Unbeknownst to most of us, I fear most especially perhaps people in the business community in this country. So we've come together as a pickup team, if you will. Again, national security experts, specialists on China, business leaders like some you'll be hearing from this morning, as well as human rights and religious freedom activists and others, for the purpose of, most importantly, exposing the true character of the Chinese Communist Party and its agenda, and helping Americans and others understand it for what it is, a present, indeed growing danger. And not just in terms of our business interests, not just in terms of our geostrategic interests more broadly, but to the very existence of the United States itself. We're going to discuss specifically today how that's manifesting itself in the economic warfare battle space. A number of the people who will be presenting are deeply knowledgeable about that, have been writing, working on, warning about this problem for many years. And I couldn't be more proud that they have pulled together with us to try to help those of you here, those of you joining us virtually, and millions of Americans outside of this immediate conversation to know what we're up against, and as importantly, to understand what we can do about this present danger. That is our mission. It is laid out in a brief statement, along with some guiding principles that are at your place settings. I commend it to you. It's the common platform that we've pulled together behind and that we're going to be working to advance. Also on the table is a list of the current membership of the Committee on the Present Danger. I think you'll be impressed by the caliber of the people that are currently working with us, and more are coming online each day. There's also a statement that we issued about a month ago now at the launch of this effort. And by the way, if you're interested in getting a sort of preliminary exposure to the kinds of issues we'll be talking about a lot, the launch event was terrific. We had 21 members of the committee presenting in 4-minute increments descriptions of the threats as they see them from their particular areas of expertise. It's fascinating. It's all available at presentdangerchina.org. As is the launch event, the launch of this series of roundtable discussions in Washington about 2 weeks ago, featuring one of our guests here today, Steve Bannon. We also had Newt Gingrich, Ted Cruz, Representative Chris Stewart, and others. I want to simply say this is a resource we hope you will be continuing to tap. I hope you'll find this morning's program describing the economic warfare battle space, what the Chinese are up to in it, and most especially what we can do to thwart them in their design against us, to be of very great use to you and hopefully help us make some important course corrections as a nation. Our first speaker is going to be Roger W. Robinson. Roger is one of the heroes, as I mentioned, of the struggle with the Soviet Union. Largely unsung hero at that, but nonetheless, he's going on from there as a senior director for international economic affairs in the National Security Council under President Reagan to launch his own company, RWR Advisory Group. He has also served as the chairman of the Congressional Economic and Security Commission, an incredibly important institution for sort of second opinions on what's going on with the Chinese, especially under his distinguished leadership. He is also the chairman of a very highly regarded think tank, which he helped found in Prague, in the Czech Republic, called the Prague Security Studies Institute. He is speaking to us today in that capacity. Roger Robinson, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Frank. It's always a privilege to be with the home team. So many recognizable faces from decades of being in the national security space, and it's just a real pleasure to be back with Frank and the team. We're a little bit constrained on time, and so I'm going to try to move through quite a lot in a short period of time, but as Frank mentioned, we're looking at the economic and financial dimensions of China's hybrid warfare activities directed toward the United States and its allies. As you know, there's a lot of attention to this, fortunately now, from Belt and Road Initiative to Made in China 2025. And as we've gone through step by step, examining these initiatives more carefully, we found that, of course, they're absolutely chock-a-block with strategic content. Indeed, the notion that these are benign commercial development projects is luckily been largely debunked. And we're dealing with a very ambitious and sometimes insidious set of efforts. We took it upon ourselves to try to look at this in a more granular fashion. And about 7 years ago, our firm, and I am representing the Prague Security Studies Institute today. RWR is more of an impartial data provider. But that said, we took it upon ourselves to try to track every Chinese transaction outside of China globally on a daily basis. And that data now goes back some 6 years. These are not just being tracked, but they're being visually mapped. And so this is what, this is the, I'm sorry, we are a little bit out of order here, so if I might, I'll see if I can't. Yeah, this is China's global footprint as it exists today, and I mean up to the date. So it gives you just a quick visual image of where those, the intensity of those dots are located. I don't think there's a surprise, much of a surprise to anyone there. We also try to organize the data in a manner that illuminates specific security-related challenges. If I can go back, for example, we were the first company some 4 or 5 years ago to identify every Chinese state-owned enterprise doing business in the South China Sea, in the building of the illegal islands and militarizing them. And when you look at not just the parent companies, but their networks of subsidiaries, and take it, you blow out that global footprint of where they are around the world, this is what you come up with. So as you can see, these companies are well known. They have large global footprints, and yet, to my knowledge, there's never been one sanctioned by the United States to date. As dangerous a circumstance as this is. As you know, that water weighs $5 trillion a year in trade, and yet so far China's walked without any major penalty. Here's what a global footprint of Huawei looks like. We do this in both city views as well as country views. These are colors of the regions of the world. The number of transactions in various countries dictates the size of those bubbles. China Communications Construction Company. This is the largest Chinese entity in Belt and Road. So its footprint is particularly important. They are the dredging company that helped build the islands, and there's a lot of stories about this. They tried to go to the Hong Kong Stock Exchange for an IPO on $1 billion, and luckily we played a role in trying to interdict that deal by the very fact that they were unwilling to disclose their activities in the South China Sea as being controversial and worthy of material risk consideration in the prospectuses. Why? Because, of course, these are illegal activities. They're sanctionable. There's legislation from Marco Rubio and others that's pending right now that could sanction. And yet, CCCC, when they were confronted by the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, demurred and said, no, 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 this is the same as Exxon drilling off of New Jersey. There's no controversy here. We're not going to register this as a risk. And finally, with the threat of class action lawsuit, Hong Kong Stock Exchange insisted, and they withdrew the IPO and that $1 billion rather than to have to admit or disclose the fact that they were engaged in disputed, controversial activities. This is important because it gets down to how we're going to help resolve this issue, not just through sanctions, but market principles. I mean, what about disclosure, transparency, proper risk management, good corporate governance, protecting of share value and corporate reputation. These are all market principles and tools that we can effectively use to hold Chinese entities accountable as they don't come in but pour in to our debt and equity markets, which is I'm going to be getting to shortly. So this is just the country view of CCCC. I thought it was timely to just take a quick glance of China and Iran. You know, my guess is China has no intention of curtailing its business activities in Iran and its deliveries of oil. It's the largest taker of Iranian oil. I think it's as much as half of their production. So they've made pretty plain that they're not going anywhere. So we're looking at every Chinese company in Iran, all of their subsidiaries, mapping their global footprints, because in the event that the Trump administration should decide to actually do something, namely follow through on its threat of secondary sanctions. You know, where are these companies doing business? What kind of leverage do we have? How many of them are doing business in American cities? How many are listed on the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ or trading over the counter in our markets? I mean, these are going to be relevant questions. This is 21st century warfighting. This, in my judgment, is the sixth domain of American warfighting, namely the economic and financial warfighting domain. Look at it. Look for it coming to a neighborhood near you. We've got air, land, space. We have air, land, sea, cyber, space. But where is the area of our single greatest dominance? The economic and financial domain. They're in our sandbox. We're not in theirs. And yet, we haven't exercised a fingernail of our leverage to curtail their predations and their hostile activities directed toward the United States. So that's just a quick look at IntelTrack, and there's more to say on that in the way we slice and dice that data. Now, going back quickly, because time is an issue here, to the cap markets, China has over 650 companies in our debt and equity markets today. Maybe around 86 in the New York Stock Exchange, 62 in NASDAQ, well over 500 in the over-the-counter markets. Why? Because, of course, they're less regulated. And you can bet that they're shopping for as little transparency, as little disclosure as they can possibly attain. Now, the alarming part of this is that the pace, the sheer pace of the money we're talking about now, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars, moving rapidly toward $1 trillion. So we're not talking about a few tens of billions here. We're talking about hundreds of billions. Now, it raises a question. Given the fact that the United States has never put up any kind of security-minded screening mechanism over our cap markets, like we have with CFIUS and FIRMA in the trade portfolio, where at least we're making an effort to vet Chinese investment in the United States to find out who these people are, what are their true intentions, do we have a national security threat there that's worthy? Nothing like that's happening vis-a-vis the cap markets, never has, and that's the root of the problem. So in trying to summarize, and we can perhaps return to some of this in the Q's and A's, there are two major new material risk categories that should properly be focused on. One is national security related risk, and the second is human rights related risk and the abuses there. And I'm thinking about such activities as Hike Vision and its surveillance cameras and equipment that is permeating the detention camps, some would say the concentration camps, holding a million Uyghurs today. When you look at the indexes, like the MSCI Emerging Market Index, it's tracked by $2 trillion of funds under management. It's mimicked by 14 trillion more. Every time they add a Chinese company, and they're doubling the number in the next 12 months, as much as $14, $16 trillion automatically buy those stocks. Now, you know, some of these companies are major national security and human rights abusers. Take, as I say, Hikvision on the human rights side, China Unicom, AVIC, China Shipbuilding. In other words, when you look at these companies, and I wanted to describe some of what they do, but I'm already getting the sign here from Frank, which I know him too well, which is get out now. That said, perhaps we can return to who these folks are. But let me assure you that those profiles are very troubling. I mean, these are very risky entities on the part of those who look at risk, and they are bad actors in the eyes of those who care about national security and human rights. So I will leave you with there at this time, but leave it to say that we have a real opportunity here if we're prepared to mobilize. Remember, this is your money. All of us are in the markets. I don't know how many millions, hundreds of millions of Americans, probably 180, 200 million Americans have portfolios. We've looked at the public pension systems. We've looked at the mutual funds, the index funds, and so forth. It's not pretty. So wittingly or unwittingly, you're holding bad actors in portfolio. So I'll just leave you with the notion that we all have a right and a responsibility to take action here and call for the kind of disclosure that we need to know as prospective investors. I mean, that's the very least that can be done. And that's not a huge claim. I mean, that's not a huge ask, after all. We're not talking sanctions and market restrictions and trying to damage the competitiveness of our exchanges and all that Wall Street's going to come after us with as they fearmonger you away from this topic. We're looking at disclosure, transparency, market principles, and if we stick with that, it's a very strong suit. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Roger. I should have noted for this audience in particular that in a previous incarnation, Roger was a vice president and special assistant to the chairman of the board of a company here in town, as I recall, Chase Manhattan Bank, before he went into the administration of Ronald Reagan. Thank you. The unenviable task I have is trying to truncate a whole series of presentations that I would love to have go much longer, as I know would you. But we will have some time, if we're disciplined, to actually engage in a bit of Q&A. Next up, I'm very pleased to have a friend and colleague of many years as well, Gordon Chang. Gordon is well known, I'm sure, to this audience and many others besides, from his myriad appearances as one of the country's real duty experts on Asia, specifically on China, as the author of 3 terrific books, The Coming Collapse of China being particularly relevant, also Nuclear Showdown, North Korea Takes on the World, and most recently, Losing South Korea. He's a contributor to the Daily Beast, and I'm pleased to say to my radio program, Secure Freedom Radio, each week. Gordon Chang, where are you? Come forth. Thank you very much. He's going to talk about... We've asked Gordon to talk a little bit about unrestricted warfare, a term that's in the title of this program, and specifically how it applies in the economic battle space, notably in the Belt and Road Initiative. Thank you. Gordon. Welcome. Good to have you.
The Committee on the Present Danger, China, is the first line of defense of our free society and free societies everywhere. It is truly an honor for me to be here today, so thank you so much, Frank. As Frank mentioned, China is conducting unrestricted warfare against the United States, and this challenge is multifaceted. It is military, diplomatic, technological, it is ideological, and it's political. But there's also one other aspect that Roger just mentioned. When the Belt and Road Initiative was first announced in 2013 to connect the great cities of China's coast to Europe and the points in between, this was limited to those routes. but subsequently it's been broadened to the rest of the world. So we do know that China's challenge is global, and that global challenge is economic. And as Roger mentioned, the struggle is going to be determined, I believe, by the country which has the stronger economy. After all, the Soviet Union gained adherence when its economy looked strong, and it lost the Cold War when it was apparent it could not keep up. This is the way the world is. It's unfortunate, but unfortunately, that's where we are. And we're seeing the same dynamic this century as well. China is gaining ground because people think its economy is strong, especially after the global downturn in 2008. The Chinese, who have always been full of confidence, then became even more arrogant, maintaining that they would dominate and rule the world, and that the United States and the rest of the West was in decline. So one of the ways to meet Beijing's challenge, and perhaps the primary way to meet that challenge, is to outcompete, outgrow, outproduce China. And that means everything is on the line in the trade talks between the United States and China. This is our opportunity to define our future, and this is an opportunity for us to not save communists in China. The United States has saved Chinese communism a number of times, starting with President Nixon. Now, President Nixon in the early 1970s, when he saw Mao Zedong, people could argue it was a good thing for us to do because that was, for us, most people thought, a weak point in the Cold War. But we also saved communism in China in 1989 after the Tiananmen Massacre. Bush 41 did that, and he didn't have a good reason to 30 years ago. And by the way, we mark that anniversary this June. President Clinton didn't have a reason to do that in 1999 when he inked the agreement with Beijing that paved its way into the World Trade Organization. And we certainly do not have a reason to do that now, especially now, because somebody who I think is the world's most dangerous figure, Xi Jinping, needs a lifeline. Xi Jinping's economy is weak. The official National Bureau of Statistics says that China grew 6.6% last year, but that number is obviously too high. It's inflated. In December, a professor at Renmin University in Beijing said in 2018, China would grow no more than 1.67%. He said the economy might even contract. And that sounds about right. In March, where there was slight rebound, that followed 3 months of evident contraction. But this rebound in March was caused by something that the Chinese leaders said that they would never do, and that is to flood their economy with debt. Because of this debt, there is a small recovery, but that recovery is not sustainable. If you look at what they've been doing over the last couple months, they have been creating debt at a pace which is 5.5 times faster than the production of nominal GDP. That's up from a pace of 1.5 times just a year ago. So this is not sustainable. What is sustainable for China is signing a trade deal with the United States. So I say, let's not sign. And there are 5 reasons I'll talk about today for not signing. First of all, Beijing has not honored any of the previous trade deals with the United States or with the international community. So why do we think that we should remedy this problem by signing another agreement with China? Second, the Chinese system does not believe in the notion of comparative advantage, which underpins the global trading system. So what's the point of talking with Beijing? Third, an agreement is going to open up the Chinese economy to American companies. That means they're going to become more involved in China, and that means we become, not only they, but we become more vulnerable to Beijing. Even if it were in our interest to become more vulnerable, and of course it's not, but even if it were in our interest to do that, it's not going to do our companies any good because Xi Jinping has been hostile to foreign companies. Xi Jinping, for about a half decade, has been reversing reform, increasing the power of the state. When you increase the power of the state, you make it much more difficult for foreign companies to prosper. And we've seen this with something that Roger mentioned, which is the Made in China 2025 program. Fourth, Xi Jinping does not believe in the legitimacy of the Westphalian international system. For more than a decade, he's been dropping hints that China is the world's only sovereign state. So what's the point of helping somebody who actually believes this? And fifth, China has been using the proceeds of commerce with the U.S. to expand their military, while their senior officers have openly been talking about killing Americans. Twice in December, a senior officer of the People's Liberation Army urged in public unprovoked attacks on the U.S. Navy in the global commons. In the second of these outbursts, which occurred on the 20th, a rear admiral said that China should use its Dongfeng 21D and Dongfeng 26 missiles to sink 2 aircraft carriers and kill 10,000 Americans. Now, this statement is not official policy of Beijing, but nonetheless, it is believed to reflect thinking in the senior ranks of the Chinese military. So why should we help this admiral and his colleagues in this particular circumstance? And let's remember, the Chinese have gone beyond just talking about this. Last May, the Wall Street Journal reported that China lasered a U.S. C-130 from their overseas military base in Djibouti, injuring 2 pilots. You injure 2 pilots, you have to assume that they're trying to bring down the plane. If you're trying to bring down a plane, you're trying to kill the crew. We also learned that last spring that China caused brain injuries to our diplomats in the Guangzhou consulate. So, why are we maintaining cordial relations with this country? What should we do on trade? Well, first of all, I think that President Trump should cancel the tariff increase reprieve that he granted in February. I also think that we should increase the tariffs beyond that 25%, and we should ban the importation of goods into the United States that have benefited from the theft of U.S. intellectual property, and we should ban the importation of goods sold by any company that has stolen American IP. We can do this. Many people say that we can't, but we got to remember that last year, China's merchandise trade surplus with the United States accounted for 129.6% of its overall merchandise surplus, 129.6%. So China's overwhelming dependence on the U.S. gives President Trump extraordinary leverage over the Chinese. Now, most everyone believes that the United States and China cannot separate their economies, but Chinese leaders are concerned about it. Premier Li Keqiang, at his once-a-year press conference in March of this year, said, look, the decoupling of U.S. and China is neither realistic nor possible. Well, if it's not possible, then why is he talking about it? Will disengagement hurt us? Yes, of course it will. But we've got to remember that we're already suffering grievous wounds. Each year, China steals hundreds of billions of dollars of U.S. intellectual property. Some people say it's only $150 billion. Other people say $600 billion. But whatever it is, it's much too large. We have an innovation-based economy. If we cannot commercialize our innovation, we do not have an economy of the future. The one thing that disengagement will do is it will decrease the opportunities for Chinese parties to steal U.S. IP. I can understand the motivations for the Chinese to steal, but what I can't understand is why we as a nation have let them do it. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is on us. We need to disengage. We need to disengage now. I not only say no trade deals with countries that want to kill Americans, I say also no trade with them at all. And by God, we should not rescue Chinese communism again. Thank you.
Gordon, thank you very much for very important messages on several fronts. I did want to just say that the senior military officers that he mentioned who were calling for attacks on American carrier battle groups may not be expressing the party line, as it were, but they haven't been demoted or, removed from service either, which is a message to everybody. Next up, I'm very pleased to say we have one of your own here in the New York financial sector, Kyle Bass, who is well known for his acumen on the hedge fund business, but especially, I think, for the work that he has been doing with respect to China, notably with Hong Kong. He is, of course, the Chief Financial Investment Officer of Heyman Capital Management. He is also the author of a new piece, which I understand he's going to unveil here and make available to those of you whose emails we have, about the quiet panic in Hong Kong. Kyle Bass, where are you? There you are. Welcome. Come on up.
It's an honor to be here, and an honor to be here with guys like Gordon and Roger. I took a couple of notes. I needed my pom-poms there. Those were great speeches. But I think from the perspective, if you don't mind, I'll start by commenting real quickly on what Roger said. When you look at China's economy, they purport to have an economy that's 15% of global GDP. When you look at cross-border currency settlement, they don't even represent 1% of cross-border currency settlement. So we kind of take their word for their domestic RMB-based economy converted back at a rate that they stipulate as the rate. And we give them credit for being 15% of global GDP. For the last 6 or 7 years, our work has basically shown that China is desperately short of US dollars. They run their own economy where they have RMB, where they control the printing press, and they printed more money than any economy in the history of the world has printed domestically. So they run the printing press, they run the police, right? They run the narrative, and they also control the price level domestically of everything except really their real estate. So they can control their own economy, but what they can't control are their dollar reserves. And I think Roger was getting to the point that the Chinese companies list in Hong Kong primarily, and raise money in both Hong Kong, Europe, and the U.S. They raise dollars primarily. They're so desperately short dollars, and that's starting to really show itself. And to Roger's point, they're borrowing so many dollars. He was mentioning that we're headed to $1 trillion. In fact, Chinese corporate borrowing in dollars has already eclipsed $1 trillion last year. It's gone to about 1.1 trillion. And the inclusion of the MSCI, as you saw the articles in the Wall Street Journal, saying that China pressured MSCI with all the pressure they could put on them to get their representative weightings increased, which is happening now. They're actually going from 5% weighting to a 20% weighting, which is forcing U.S. retirees that index to these things. All of our money is going into companies that actually don't have Big Four auditors. They actually don't allow audits. They file glossy financial statements or annual reports. I don't mean to go off on a rant here, but I think it's important to understand exactly where China is and what we take for granted, I think, in financial reporting. One of the other issues that you brought up, Roger, was basically the primary and secondary sanctions. As these sanctions on Iran go into place, all of the companies that do business with the Iranian National Oil Company and the Iranian National Shipping Company and everyone that's listed in the primary sanctions are secondarily sanctionable. And that is up to the United States government to go ahead and sanction those secondary entities. But you think about one thing that we can do, I think, with this organization, I think we can also, let's say, issue edicts as far as what the U.S. can do as action items. And one thing we can do is all pensions and endowments run under an IRS exemption, a tax exemption. And so if the IRS issued guidance that said you're not allowed to invest in primary sanctioned entities, period, it's against the law, and if an entity is secondarily sanctionable, or what we deem to be secondary sanctionable, continuing to do business with primary sanctioned companies, we should just make them, we should force divestment. If you want to keep your tax exemption, you're not allowed to invest in these things. That's trillions of dollars. It's something easy for our country to do. So that's something I chair the risk committee of the largest public endowment in the U.S., University of Texas, and we implemented that policy last year. And so that should happen. That should be a forced happening, I think, from the perspective of the IRS. Comment real quickly on something Gordon said. He said the strongest economy wins. And I think that's exactly true. And Roger proved through working with the Saudis that you could pump enough oil to get oil to $10 and destroy the Russians. And for that, we all thank you, Roger. But I think looking forward to China, we talk about IP theft, and they've stolen, whether you're looking at DOD reports or USTR reports to the president, they steal $200 to $300 billion a year of IP. It's interesting. That's a pretty big number, right? I've never seen one public company file an 8K showing evidence of IP theft. And there's $200 to $300 billion of it a year. So I think we should force public companies that go complain to the government to file 8Ks. All right, so I'm going to get off of that rant because I really enjoyed those prior two speeches. Talking about Hong Kong is functionally relevant to the entire picture of what's going on in China. If you believe that China is desperately short dollars, Hong Kong is where China raises all of its dollars around the world. If you remember how Hong Kong's agreement came with the U.S. and with Great Britain, with the U.S. it came in 1992 in the Hong Kong U.S. Policy Act that Mitch McConnell led in the Senate. It got signed. And basically, we treat Hong Kong as its own sovereign, even though China technically controls Hong Kong. As long as Hong Kong maintains its democratic electoral process, its autonomy in its economy, and its autonomy in its judiciary, we treat them as their own nation, and we have a free trade agreement with them. They're a most favored nation trading status. We don't have any of the tariffs that we put on China, or any of the manner in which we deal with China from a trade perspective doesn't happen to Hong Kong as long as they maintain that autonomy. So I'm going to get into, real quickly, a quick financial picture of Hong Kong, and then I'm going to talk to you about the political side, because the financial picture of Hong Kong is, let's say, one of the worst in the world. Their banking sector is almost 9 times their GDP. Their household leverage, when you look at private sector credit to GDP in Hong Kong, I have a couple of slides that I want to show you really quickly. And I don't know which order they're in. All right, well, I'll talk here first. Hong Kong used to be the southern port for China. This is a ratio of Hong Kong's GDP in the numerator and China's GDP in the denominator. So this is what represented percentage of China's economic importance did Hong Kong used to represent. So in the mid-90s, it was as high as almost 30%. And what you see is as China ascended the WTO and spent all the money they've spent building out their own southern port infrastructure and their trade infrastructure, Hong Kong's become much less economically relevant, but still very financially relevant to China. It's really important to see how Hong Kong's economy has changed over time as China did that investment in their port infrastructure. The blue bars are goods, and mostly U.S. dollar-based goods. The red bars are services. So Hong Kong used to be a big exporter of goods and a big importer of services. And right around the financial crisis, their economy flipped. And their economy flipped to today. They're actually a massive net U.S. dollar-based goods importer, and they're a services exporter. And they export to China, right? Hong Kong faces China for about 80% of their GDP. What's happened in Hong Kong in the last 10 years is something that will never happen again. So since they're pegged to our currency, the US dollar, they import our rates. So when our rates went to 0 in 2008, their largest trading partner went to the gas pedal, China. So what happened to Hong Kong real estate from 2008 to today is the largest real estate increase in world history. As you all know, Hong Kong real estate is the most expensive real estate in the world. It trades around $10,000 a square foot. And the reason being, it was free money for 10 years, and their largest trading partner was growing double digits. Now that's reversing. Household leverage, when you get private sector credit to GDP in Hong Kong, is now the highest in the world. It's 300% of GDP. The other two lines here are the US and Japan. Their banking sector is now 8.5 times GDP. You guys remember Iceland, Ireland, Cyprus back when the European crisis was happening? Those dominoes fell in the order of the size of their banking system. Hong Kong's banking system is now as large as they were then. With another fun fact, the two largest banks in Hong Kong, HSBC and Standard Chartered, are orphan children of British financial institutions that don't have any British depositors. So I think those banks are in a precarious position. This is the key. So when you run a currency peg to the U.S., you import our rates, and then to defend that peg, you have to have what we call excess reserves. Now, this is a busy chart, but let me just put it in perspective. In the last year, Hong Kong has spent 80% of its rainy day fund defending this peg to the U.S. And the only reason pegs work is you have synchronicity in economies. Well, now Hong Kong's economy is much more relevant China's economy is much more relevant to Hong Kong than the U.S., and they're spending a lot of their rainy day funds trying to maintain this peg that's existed for 36 years. So it's a subset of what's happening in China. China's house is on fire, and now Hong Kong might need a few fire engines from China, and we're not necessarily sure all of this doesn't revalue. To Gordon's point, and thinking back to the fall of the Soviet Union, it looks to us like I don't want to say fraud, but let's say the disingenuous nature of the exchange rate between the RMB and the USD, given the fact that China is completely running out of dollars and raising dollars through Hong Kong, and Hong Kong is as levered as it is and running out of its own rainy day funds. If you have money invested in Asia, I would rethink that, and I'd rethink it very quickly. And if you have Hong Kong dollar deposits, you'd be foolish not to convert them into US dollar deposits, because you don't even earn 80 basis points more in overnight rates. So I think this is multifaceted. You need to think about the nexus of Hong Kong and China economically, but then we go to the politics. And I know a lot of you here are political animals. So if you've noticed in the last month or so, China has actually floated a proposal through Hong Kong's legislature that says they would just like to extrajudicially grab people off the streets of Hong Kong if China deems them to be a, quote, fugitive, and a fugitive means that they've broken a law that happens to be a law in China and Hong Kong. Let's just use murder, for example. If President Xi issues a warrant of arrest and calls the Hong Kong police and says, hey, this person XYZ committed murder in China and he's there in Hong Kong, we want you to ship him over to us. Hong Kong's going to be obliged to do that without due process. Now, that's not autonomous anymore. That is a breach of the 1992 agreement that the U.S. has with Hong Kong. It's a breach of the 1984 agreement that the Brits have with Hong Kong. And so China, I believe, is overplaying their hand in a big way in Hong Kong, and I think this legislation is about to become law. The most interesting thing about these agreements is the 1992 Hong Kong U.S. Policy Act is re-ratified annually by the U.S. President. The State Department owes a report to the President, and then it's up to the President to decide whether or not Hong Kong is still, quote, autonomous enough for us to give them the status that they currently have. So given the economic fragility of the region, and going back to Gordon's point, China's in a really bad place today. Running out of dollars, slowing with their economy, and the biggest credit binge in world history. Hong Kong is the most levered developed nation in the world today, and they're running out of dollars. We have them exactly where we want them right now. We should not sign a trade deal with them. We should go ahead and impose these tariffs and then negotiate something much more meaningful with them 6 months down the road. So I think you need to pay attention to both the politics and the economics of Hong Kong, which for 36 years has been a relatively stable place in Asia, and I think going forward that's actually not going to be the case. So Frank, thanks for having me.
Next, to pick up on some of these same points and expand on them, particularly I'm hoping with respect to the Belt and Road Initiative and the technology piece of what China's up to and what we need to be doing about it. I'm very pleased to introduce David Goldman. Again, I think someone you all are very familiar with, the author of a terrific column at Asia Times, although it's under his nom de plume, Spengler. He is also the author of How Civilizations Die, and very active in the markets in MicroStrategy LLC, of which he is, I believe, one of the directors, managing director. Come on up, David Goldman. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be here. This is the blood, sweat, and tears version of what you just heard. I think we can describe what we've heard as Churchillian in its feeling, and by Churchillian I mean I refer to Andrew Roberts' discussion of Churchill's view of Asia right up to Pearl Harbor, and I quote, from his wonderful new biography. Churchill said, in the event of war, the Japanese would fold up like the Italians because they were the wops of the Far East, end of quote. Of course, then we had Singapore, which was the biggest disaster for British arms in all of history. And I believe if we underestimate the Chinese, as Westerners so often underestimate Asians, we're going to have a Singapore as well. I think the situation is a good deal more difficult. Think of the Russians at Port Arthur, the Americans at Pearl Harbor, or the Yalu River, British at Singapore, and so forth. I don't believe that China's economy is in nearly as bad shape as Gordon and others seem to think. There are dozens of firms who look at satellite photographs, count the number of trucks in parking lots of Chinese factories, interview people on the ground, and so forth. I look at these every day. And in general, the Chinese growth numbers are in line with the so-called physical Li Ka-Ching index, which uses electricity and other physical transportation, other physical parameters. China is growing at over 6%. By the way, the credit growth, if you simply seasonally adjust the numbers, follows a nice gentle trend upwards. You had a huge spike because of the Lunar New Year. There's no bubble in credit growth in China. It's actually quite normal, and they appear to have cut it back. Now, recall that on January 6th, President Trump said China's not doing very well, puts us in a strong position. We are doing very well. Since then, China's stock market has gained 37% 2019 to date, which is double the gain in the U.S. stock markets. China's growth has actually come up. Ours has come back a bit. One of the main reason that U.S. growth has declined is that CapEx is way under anyone's forecast. And the main reason CapEx is down, according to David Wu at Bank of America, a number of other analysts, is because since no one knows where global supply chains are going to end up, no one is making outlay decisions. So it's quite possible that the trade war has damaged short-term U.S. economic growth more than it's damaged Chinese growth. I support President Trump. I applaud him for calling China out, but I don't think the tools that he's using will get the results we want. For example, early in 2018, the United States banned exports of chips to ZTE, virtually shut down ZTE. At that point, the Chinese government called Huawei and said, you now have an unlimited research budget to create substitutes. Huawei ran a crash program. As of December 2018, they were self-sufficient. In other words, an export ban would have no effect on their business except to raise their cost a bit. And a Japanese study just published by Nikkei reports that Huawei's handset chips are now equal or better than Apple's. So all we've done is give the Chinese an opportunity to make themselves more autarkical. The Huawei campaign has been, I think, one of the most sorriest episodes in U.S. diplomacy in history. As you know, the United States told its allies not to use Huawei technology for the 5G rollout because it would give China an opportunity for espionage. The result of that is even the British, not to mention the West Germans, Malaysians, South Koreans, Indians, and a dozen others, Poles, Czechs, and Hungarians, have told us, no, thank you very much, but we're going to use Huawei equipment. Why is this? We don't make any of these systems. We used to. Cisco used to dominate the market. Cisco has $72 billion worth of cash in the bank. Huawei spent $72 billion in R&D in the last 6 years. The alternatives, like Ericsson and Nokia, make their chips in China. The Chinese can put backdoors into those chips as easily as they can into Huawei chips. So that didn't work out too well for us. To paraphrase Leon Trotsky, you may not be interested in industrial policy, but industrial policy is interested in you. How did all of this happen? The Asian model means treating capital-intensive industry as a public good. In other words, a chip foundry or a steel mill will be subsidized by low-interest credit or some other means, the same way that we subsidize a sports arena or an airport as a public good. This is the Japanese model since the Meiji Restoration. The South Koreans adopted it, the Taiwanese. The difference is there are 1.5 billion Chinese, and the impact of the Asian model on a country that big on the world economy is enormous. So the result is that all the elements of the modern digital economy, integrated circuits, laser-powered optical networks, sensors, displays, which were developed in the United States, every one of them, most of them with support from the Defense Department and NASA, are now produced overseas. America's shipments of semiconductors were 25% of the world total in 2011 and 10% in 2018, and will probably be down to 2% in the next 5 years as the Chinese massively invest in chip foundries, the Taiwanese leap ahead of Intel in terms of quality control. And in terms of the future, if you look at quantum computing, which is probably emblematic of the critical game-changing technologies, China is spending $11 billion for a single quantum computing facility in Hefei. President Trump just signed a bill into law in December authorizing $1.2 billion for quantum computing research in the next 5 years. So what is the point of the Belt and Road Initiative in this case? China has a demographic problem long term. We studied this at the Department of Defense a few years ago. The point of Belt and Road, above all, is to lock into the Chinese system 2 countries with a population of 2 billion people, to give China control of all the potential surplus of labor in the world, starting with Southeast Asia. The spearhead is Huawei and the telecommunications companies. Now, I spent some time as an investment banker in China with Huawei calling on foreign governments. And the message is, let us in, you'll be like China. We'll make you into a little China. First, you'll get telecommunications. Then we'll bring in Alibaba. You'll get e-commerce. So all these people in your hills are going to be working for Chinese commercialization. Farmers in northern Thailand are now getting text messages from Japanese food processing companies owned by Alibaba telling them what to plant based on big data weather forecasting and the Alibaba analysis of the food market. So once you bring in transportation, communications, you basically lock billions of people into a Chinese system controlled by Chinese companies with Chinese financing run by Chinese marketers. This is not all that far from us. Huawei is building the national broadband system in Mexico as we speak. Now, forget about the rest of the world. This is on our borders. So this would have gone much further if the Chinese hadn't been rapacious, incompetent, greedy, and corrupt in many of their dealings with any number of their prospective victims in the Belt and Road Initiative. But I don't think we can count on the Chinese not to correct their problems. The Belt and Road Initiative is a huge issue. So what do we do about it? This is the blood, sweat, and tears part. The trade tariffs are simply not going to cut it. Gordon is, I generally agree with him about disengaging, but specifically the way to disengage is we need to bring the entire silicon foundry business back to the United States. That will cost hundreds of billions of dollars. It will be disruptive and difficult, and big tech in the United States isn't going to like it, may not be great for their stock prices. But not to control our own semiconductor industry is like being a European power in the 19th century that doesn't produce steel for cannons. Secondly, we need to create our own Belt and Road competitive initiative in common with the Japanese and South Koreans and others, and offer an alternative to China. Chinese are hated in most of the world. It would be easy to offer them an alternative, but we're not, and we'll have to do it in size to be effective. And finally, we need something like Eisenhower's National Defense Education Act. Our biggest single problem is that China graduates 4 bachelor's degrees in STEM for everyone that we do, and the trend is going against us. 33% of Chinese undergraduates study engineering against 7% in the United States. 80% of all doctoral candidates in electrical engineering and computer science in the U.S. are foreign, most of them Chinese. They're going home, and what we've done in the United States is to train a world-class faculty for Chinese universities. So Chinese students are now not, fewer are applying to American universities. Unless we reverse that and build the talent at home, and I would also say we should be organizing a brain drain of China's most talented, we're going to lose. So in my view, it's fanciful to believe that short-term measures can destabilize this Chinese juggernaut. It's going to be difficult and expensive on the scale of the efforts we made to win the Cold War or the missile race with Russia or World War II. It's going to be difficult, but most assuredly we can do it. Thank you very much.
David Goldman, thank you very much. Next up, Dan David, a man who has been active in exposing fraud undertaken by the Chinese, part of a film called The China Hustle, in which he is a lead protagonist, focuses on this. His company, Geo Investing, has itself uncovered some $15 billion worth of such malpractice. And he bills himself and is most welcome here as a champion of free speech, which we are very pleased to be able to exercise on this occasion with his help. Dan, welcome.
So thank you all for having me here. And I find myself saying the same thing I've said for the last 10 years. I have no idea how I got here. It's a crazy story. I am an average person, incredibly average, from an average place, Flint, Michigan, raised with a great working family. And I came across the most wild and crazy story of fraud that you could make up. And so I'm going to tell you the story and tell you who I am, because who I am is who you are. And who I am is nobody, everybody, and you. And it starts in 2008. Some of you may have heard that was a choppy year for the financial markets. Going into November, we were a little crestfallen. And we looked for the greatest opportunity in investing, for the greatest value in investing, and we saw China in 2009. And we went all in. And man, we're talking 80–90% of everything we had was invested in China. And we picked up 229% in 2009. We were rock stars. We knew what we were doing. And then in 2010, some of these evil short sellers started to say some of the companies that we had invested in and exited because it hit a price target that we were comfortable with were frauds. And my partner and I decided right away that, A, they were wrong, but we needed to prove they were wrong. Because if they weren't, then we just got lucky. And 2008 was going to happen to us all over again. So we hired researchers to go on the ground in China. And we investigated 30 companies. And our researchers came back and said the short sellers are wrong. They're understating the problem. Fraud is out in the open. These factories are Potemkin villages. They will bring an investment bank road tour. Buses of people will show up, get off, and see a running, robust factory. They get on the bus, they leave, the next day, factory shuts down. They're all temporary workers. For any of you that have seen the China Hustle, you saw that once we saw this happen, we put up time-lapse surveillance cameras and caught this in action over and over again. So a nobody from Flint, Michigan had 12 companies delisted from our exchanges and exposed $15 billion in fraud. And that's what all of you can do once you set your mind to it, once you see where it's at. And I will tell you right away that when our researchers came back and said that fraud is out in the open, Our first inclination wasn't to be short. I went to the exchanges, and I said, this is what's happening. They said, get out of here. Who are you? I went to the investment banks. I said, you should hire us to do your due diligence because we're obviously better at it than you are. And you're taking 10% transaction fees representing frauds. They said, you want us to pay you not to collect fees? Because if you come back and tell us we're a fraud, we can't collect the fee. Get out of here. We're going to sue you. After being told this enough times, we left, we published our reports, and we started crashing billion-dollar companies. And the investment banks kept their promise. They sued us. Of course. And again, I don't know how I got here, but it starts with a $247 million lawsuit. Now, I don't care how tough you think you are and what you think you've done when you've crashed a billion-dollar company. When a $247 million lawsuit lands on your desk, you get a lump in your throat. It's tough. Thank God it was that much money. If it would have been $10 million, I had to think about it. But for $247 million, I dug my feet in. And we fought and we won. Why? Because we have something, I have something, as a low-born, average citizen that you don't have in China. Freedom of speech. And we stick it to them with the freedom of speech. We go at them with the freedom of speech. That's right. They can't do it, we can do it. I was the first short seller, I guess that's what I am now, own it, to go to Hong Kong and deliver a short report on stage at the Sohn conference. Yes, I had my plane ticket in my pocket and left 2 hours after the presentation. Because I'll tell you, to Kyle's point, it is not one country, two systems anymore. I've been there over the last 4 years, and now I'm telling you, at most, it is one country, 1.5 systems, and I believe it is one country. I had dinner with a Hong Kong regulator the night after my second speech, and I said, look, you know the company I presented on is a fraud. They're 300 miles away from here right now. You can go see what I said and what I showed you on my presentation. He said, no, I can't. So when China wants something from Hong Kong, they remind us we're one country. When Hong Kong wants something on a China-based company, they remind us we're two systems. And that's how it works with them now. But you have to understand, we have to call out the truth. I went to Congress, and I spoke to Congress, 15 of our representatives in Congress and in the Senate. And I came home, my wife asked me, what did you learn? That many of our members of Congress are really dumb. And that is funny because it is so true. I, as a citizen, go down there and say, look, here's a fact. It's not illegal in China to steal from an American citizen. To this day. And I remember members of Congress are like, what? Oh, okay, I'm telling you this. You're in Congress and you don't know. No, they don't know. They didn't know. And then they started asking me, what should we do about it? I said, I should go to my congressman. That's what I'm doing right now. You're asking me what we should do about it. So the next year, I went down there with a plan. Okay, they want to know, what should we do about it? I said, nuclear option, delist them all. Of course, we can't do that. How about, if you're going to call the market a buyer beware environment, it says on a pack of cigarettes, if you smoke these enough, they'll kill you. How about you put a little asterisk next to the ticker symbol of these companies? You can pull it down and say, hey, by the way, if this executive steals all the assets of this company, which they've done hundreds of times now, to the tune of over $100 billion, they're not prosecutable. Just make investors aware. They're not prosecutable if they steal all your money. No, couldn't get that done either. Why? Because China is buying our freedom of speech. We cannot control their media or have an influence in their narrative, in their media. They can control and have an influence and a narrative in our media, which is when you speak pejoratively about a China-based company, it's almost tacit racism. When you say that I'm protecting my country against a China-based country, then again, what do you have against China? I don't have anything against China. I have something against companies that lie, cheat, and steal. And I point this out to all of us here. A Chinese chicken farmer doesn't wake up one day and know how to defraud the U.S. capital markets. They are taught how to do it by us. Our banks, our institutions. So my problem isn't with China or the Chinese. It is with American institutions, American banks, Chinese institutions, Chinese banks that are committing fraud. That's not a people problem, that's an institutional problem. And nobody goes to jail for it. Not one has ever gone to jail for it. And they need to do that. And China understands. Here's the culture difference. It's not in the math. Math is science. The problem is accounting is an art form. And they have some Jackson Pollocks over there. So the culture difference that we do have is that when China is attacked, they see themselves as circular units. Their family is the tightest circle. Their village is an outer circle. Their province is an outer circle of pride. And then their country. They don't have a whistleblower program in China. A whistleblower program is like, you know, you'll hear the whistle blowing as the bullet goes through your head. They don't tell on each other. So they have that circular, tight-knit group. When they circle their wagons, they're tough. The United States used to be that way. But now, when we circle our wagons, we're here, they're there, they throw a bag of money in the middle, our wagons break. So I'm an average citizen saying that we can all do more. We've exposed $15 billion. We'll continue to do that. We are actively telling the truth every day through freedom of speech. And I would ask you to join me in doing the same and to never be afraid to say you're proud to be an American and you're proud to protect your country. Thank you very much.
Amen to that. As the cleanup batter in this impressive program, I'm very pleased to introduce another old friend, well known again to this community, not least because of his time working for Goldman Sachs. Subsequently, he has played a major role at the national political level, notably as the chairman of Breitbart, and subsequently as the chairman of the Trump 2016 campaign, and subsequent to that as the strategic advisor to President Trump in the White House. He needs no further introduction other than to say a great welcome to Steve Bannon.
Thank you, Frank. One of the first things I want to do is get our nomenclature, our vernacular, correct. The most important audience we have here today is not the illustrious folks from Wall Street, our financial community, the national security folks that have joined us. It's not the people at CNBC and Yahoo Finance, all the great TV networks and channels we have here today that lead the world, Bloomberg, in providing information. We have today Miles Kwok in Guo Media. And Guo Media is beaming this in right now to China. The most important audience we have is the Chinese people. The Committee on the Present Danger, everything we're talking about today, is not about the Chinese people. It is to help free the Chinese people. The enemy is very clear. It's the enemy of the Chinese people. That is a radical cadre of the CCP. A radical cadre that has taken China down a very dangerous path. These two systems, the system in Brother Goldman talked about it, or Gordon talked about the Westphalian system. These two systems are not mutually compatible. They can't both survive. We have a global house divided, half slave and half free. The slaves are the honorable, terrific, hardworking people of China. Old 100 names, the backbone of Chinese society. They have been enslaved by a radical cadre led by President Xi and Wan Qishan and others of that cadre, financed 100% by Western capitalism, financed by this city and the city of London and Frankfurt, and provided as technology appropriated by Western companies. The most shocking thing today, and I'm going to keep this short because I want Q&A to have people like Roger Robinson and Kyle Bass, Dan David, Gordon Chang, Brother Goldman, and others to be able to answer your questions. The most shocking thing today, even when we drill down on all the different aspects of this, the most shocking thing today is that this happened in April of 2019. History is going to judge us. We are going to be weighed and measured by what happened. The same scam's been being run. Same scam's being run. Brother Robinson knows this. Frank Gaffney knows this. Committee on the Present Danger, why was it set up? Because it kind of took our eye off the ball with the great threat we had in the 60s and the 70s, and that was the Soviet Union. Remember what we were told then. We were told then they're the rising power, we're the declining power. Right? We have to have rapprochement. We have to have accommodation. We have to have détente. Their system's better. Their system's more organized. Their system's going to win. It took patriots of Team B and the Committee on the Present Danger, of Democrats and Republicans, it wasn't about party affiliation, to come forward and say, and there's people like Andy Marshall, who just passed away, one of the great Americans of the 20th and 21st century. And one of the reasons I got the inspiration to sit down with Frank Gaffney and talk about reforming the Committee on the Present Danger. Because what Bill Casey and Andy Marshall said back in the 70s is, hey, let's look at the math. And guess what? The CIA and other people were wrong. Their economy was only half the size we thought. They weren't the rising power. We weren't the declining power. We had convinced ourselves. And guess who had part of that convincing? Henry Kissinger. Was it Allison Graham? The Thucydides trap crowd. It's the exact same scam. China's not the rising power. We're not the declining power. Brother Goldman, one of the first people I had come see me in the White House, gave that exact talk and brought in a couple of brilliant people with him. It's the Westphalian system that works. It's freedom that works. What better example do you need than Hong Kong and Taiwan and what the Chinese Americans have done in the United States of America? You give them freedom. You give them freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of religion. They can accomplish anything. But if you finance a gulag, you're going to get a gulag on a global scale. And trust me, the radical cadre, the CCP, that is their plan. What's most disgusting is that all of this is known. It takes brave people like Roger Robinson and Kyle Bass and others to bring it up. You don't think this math is not known by people in the city of London? You think this math is not known by people on Wall Street? In the third week of January of 2017, there were two speeches given. One in Davos and one in front of the Capitol of the United States. The first one was President Xi, went to Davos. He was hailed as a conquering hero. the guy that was going to save globalism, gave a speech, cover the Economist, cover the Financial Times, right? This was the hero. He talked about all the problems that come by this populist movement, these nationalists, right? All the hate and all the discontent coming from them. And he was lauded by the biggest consulting firms, the biggest investment banks, the biggest hedge funds that went to all the best schools. Do you think for a second that these people do not fully understand what's going on? Of course they do. But they have a higher calling, and that's money. History is going to weigh and measure us. And you have a decision. Are you going to be on the right side of history? In that same week, Donald Trump gave a speech, the American Carnage speech, which I'm very proud to have had a slight assistance to then candidate Trump in writing. The key part was not American Carnage. It was the litany of what he had talked about American decline. And finished on the line, now comes the hour of action. It is Donald Trump that has completely reversed the field and now has engaged China, really, in what I think is not a trade deal, the beginning of an armistice, because it's a war. This is the great Bible, unrestricted warfare. Unrestricted warfare. This is the book, the great book written by the two Chinese colonels in the PLA in the late 90s, which we base all of this on. This is the most significant book of strategy since Clausewitz. And this lays out in very excruciating detail in 1999 of exactly how they're going to take down the hegemon of the industrial democracies of the West. And it's like Roger said. It's no more 5 or 6 domains. It's very simple. You have information and cyber warfare, you have economic warfare, and you have kinetic warfare. And the last thing we want to do is get tangled up with the West in kinetic warfare. Because the one thing they have shown is they know how to fight. Okay? Eventually we'll get there, but we can take them down through information, and that is both media, influence, and cyber, and economic warfare. And they have been engaged in economic warfare, direct economic warfare with the West for 20 years. It is President Trump that has now reinforced our ability to combat that with the attitude that we're not the declining power. I agree with Gordon and others. I think, and I was one of the original team that got the trade, to contextualize the trade, to set the framework for it. I agree with Gordon. I think we ought to walk away from this right now. We ought to start playing hardball. We ought to start playing smash mouth. The reason is this radical cadre only understands one thing. Ask the Chinese people. Why do you think Guo Media today has to try to pierce the firewall? A firewall we should understand that's built not just by American and Western technology, but also by Western and American companies. Why does that have to happen? They don't want this information out there. In fact, as soon as it becomes a Bridge and Road Initiative is now, well, it used to be One Belt, One Road. As soon as the West starts to expose that, they want to change the term. Made in China 2025 is not to be talked about. I don't think it's had a mention in the Chinese media in 9 months. Right? They're trying to pull back from any relationship at all with Huawei with the PLA. Huawei is the PLA. And if the senior executives of Huawei don't like me saying that, then bring it. I would love to have Discovery in this one. You are the People's Liberation Army. Here's the dilemma. The dilemma is the burden is upon us. Not just the average citizens, it's our system. If we acted as fiduciaries, the underpinning of the entire financial system, why are our capital markets so robust? It's about our fiduciary responsibility. Here is why Trump and here's why the deplorables are so angry. Here's why they elected Donald Trump. They understand the factories got shipped to China. They understand the jobs went. And as J.D. Vance shows in Hillbilly Elegies, the opioids, that's what the opioid crisis is. Tariffs are not about a tax. Tariffs are about self-esteem and dignity. It's about bringing manufacturing jobs back. But more importantly, as you peel it back, the deplorables pension funds financed it. This is a Greek tragedy. The greatest power on earth, the working people that are the backbone of it, that hold our civic society together, that coach Little League, that build the churches, that serve in these desolate battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan. I was a junior officer when I was on a destroyer in the South China Sea, a South China Sea then that we were hunting for carrier battle groups to protect and hunting for Soviet submarines, never ever envisioning that an American government would look the other way when stationary aircraft carriers essentially were built to take away the freedom of navigation and the lifeline to our allies in Taiwan and South Korea and Japan. I want to wrap with one thing. Joe Biden, Joe, opening his presidential campaign today. America's an idea. America's not an idea. America's a country. America's a country with a border and a people and a land and very empowering ideas it got from the Judeo-Christian West that have been passed down from millennia. So they got the 20 candidates Joe's going to go across. New York Post provides us today, the 20 candidates, right? What their poll numbers are, what they're running on. And Joe's going to add to this. And they talk about what they stand for. And I happened to watch, I don't know if you did, I watched all 5 hours the other night of the CNN town halls. You know what's almost never mentioned? China. This is the greatest existential threat we've ever had. This makes the Soviet Union's economy, Russia's economy today is the size of New York State. When Andy Marshall and Bill Casey did the analysis for Ronald Reagan, it was the size of California. That changed the entire dynamic of the Cold War. That was the Reagan defense bill. We were never going to build a 600-ship Navy. I was the special assistant to the chief of naval operation. It was economic warfare to bury them, as was Star Wars. That's what Roger Robinson did. He's one of the unknown heroes and not well enough known. He worked on that. That's how we destroyed the Soviet Union. And by the way, CIA still got it wrong. Said it'd take 50 years. It took 8. Why? Because what did Reagan say? We win and they lose. And that's what the Committee on President Danger is. In all of this, and I'm going to wrap up shortly, they go through what everybody stands for. And I quote from the New York Post. Somebody's running on mindfulness. And that is not Marianne Williamson. She's running on at least bringing positivity. I might note to the New York Post, by the way, you've swapped the picture. This is actually Swalwell. That's Tim Ryan. Your campaign's going poorly when the New York Post gets your pictures wrong. But it's really about Joe. It's not about this group. It's Joe Biden. Joe Biden is going to be in Pennsylvania today because Joe Biden is much more woke than Hillary Clinton about what it's going to take to defeat Donald Trump. He's got to go out to, because Joe's going to start with all the union support. So Joe's got to go out to western Pennsylvania, understanding Pennsylvania, Ohio, Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota, that upper fortress of the Trump movement, which delivered this stunning victory in 2016. Biden's got to show he can bring that. What he ought to do today is be very truthful to the labor unions up there and to the steel workers. Joe Biden's got to come 100% clean on his relationship and his family's relationship with the CCP. In 2013, on Air Force Two, I think he took his son over there. 10 days later, they signed a $1 billion deal for their private hedge fund. We need to know every piece of involvement that Joe Biden has had with the Chinese Communist Party, the Bank of China, and all the financial institutions in China. And Joe Biden has to tell those steel workers it was Donald Trump that brought in the 232s, that put the tariffs on steel and aluminum, start to bring the jobs back. Remember, Trump was mocked and ridiculed about when he did the 232 and he did the 301 on technology. He was mocked and ridiculed. This could not happen. It couldn't happen at all. Joe Biden was there for 8 years. We had the Munich of the 21st century, was allowing the CCP to build those islands. And what Obama did, he moved one Marine brigade to Darwin, Australia. That's the pivot to Asia. Oh, except having President Xi come in the Rose Garden, look him in the eye, and on world TV shake his hand and said, no more cyber attacks, no more cyber theft, and doubled down in the next year. Joe Biden has to answer the question. What did you know? When did you know it? And how much money has your family and you personally taken from the most murderous regime of the 21st century? Thank you very much.
Well, how's that for a cleanup batter? Well done. Don't go away. I want all of our speakers to come up, and we'll take your questions. If you will do me a favor and them, identify yourselves. If you are with an organization and want to identify that, please do that as well. And if you have a specific person you'd like the question answered by, identify them as well. So Kyle and David and Gordon and Steve and Roger, come on up. And Dan. Are there questions? Yes, there are. You, sir, over the side there. Let's get a mic to you so that people can hear what you have to say. Come on. Go ahead. Identify yourself.
Jeff Weisenfeld, and any of the Center for Security Policy. Any of those of you who are most familiar with the capital markets in your presentation, as you may know, China shares on the exchange are now available for sale to investors here. What is the likelihood that there are a goodly number of those companies which have Potemkin villages and many of the other characteristics that have been described this morning that could ultimately cause investors here a real problem?
Question for anybody. Roger?
We have not, frankly, in our shop, been looking at the entire spectrum of fraud and misdeeds of the type that's been described today. What we are focusing on, and I think I can speak to, are two what I would call material asymmetric risk categories. National security abuses and human rights related abuses. That is our specialty. And in that regard, I was trying to give some illustrations of the fact that there is precious little, if any, due diligence being performed on what are decidedly material risk categories here. Now, that's evident when you look at the presence of companies with the kinds of profiles that I was talking about, including the Hike Visions vis-a-vis concentration camps in Xinjiang. You know, this is not what the American people had in mind. And I would only turn it over to others to talk to the issue, to other glaring problems. And hopefully those are being detected as well. But I can tell you where there is a glaring blind spot here, and that's in these two categories.
So I'm glad you asked the question. It's one thing that I think all of us forgot to mention, and it hits on something that both Roger and Dan talked about. You know, today, the Chinese companies that list, if an ADR lists in the U.S., there's a level 1, level 2, level 3 ADR. Those all have different listing requirements. So today, someone like a Chinese bank can actually raise money in the U.S. market by selling shares, and all they have to send us is a 15-page picture-filled glossy annual report. No financials, no audit. No one has to understand what is happening behind the scenes. Our listing requirements are crazy. Our SEC could snap a finger and simply say, everyone that raises money in the U.S., whether it's a stock or a bond, might have to have a real audit and might have to have financials filed just like American companies do. I mean, leveling the playing field is a snap of a finger, and the SEC should do it tomorrow. So to your point, if someone can list on the over-the-counter exchange or under a level 3 or level 2 ADR, it's insane that U.S. investors can get taken by these frauds when we should simply force audits and financial statements to get filed. So that's another something that can happen very quickly.
Yeah, I'll keep it as a short answer. Is there risk? I have piles of reports on frauds that I haven't gotten to yet. I'll be exposing some of them this year. But in an asymmetrical, a binary kind of system where you don't go to jail for fraud, but you can make money for committing it, they're going to continue to commit fraud. There are several multi-billion-dollar major IPO ADR frauds listed on our exchange, and they will be coming to a short sellers report near you soon.
John, did you have a question? John Katsimatidis?
John Katsimatidis. We have a lot of smart people on Wall Street. What is it going to take to get the message across to these guys that it's America first? It's us versus the dollars they're making today for this quarter. And I know Wall Street and the companies are, what are we going to make this quarter versus what are we going to make over the next 2 or 3 years?
I used to run fixed income research at Bank of America, credit strategies at Credit Suisse. The problem is that the U.S.-China economic relationship is, to a great extent, the construct of American companies. America's best-performing companies in terms of market cap, big tech, are largely software companies with monopolies made possible by cheap Asian electronics. So it's in the interest of the Facebooks and the Googles and so forth to keep the current arrangement where Asia dumps, particularly China, very large amounts of cheap smartphones and computers and tablets on us while they make the money on the software. Because hardware production is subsidized in Asia, Americans have gotten out of the business. As a matter of fact, there's essentially zero venture capital going into any kind of hardware production, much less investment in the United States. So we're losing our semiconductor industry. What will it take? I think what would be required, it'd be good to get Steve back in the White House. I think the president would have to get the chairman of the top 10 tech companies into the Oval Office and say, you boys have $1 trillion of cash in the bank. You're not investing. You tell me what it will take to put that stuff into brick and mortar and silicon and so forth before I find a way to tax it away from you. That's what I think it will take. Take the president to get down and dirty with them.
He's the only one that has the courage.
You're not going to like this answer, but what it's going to take is not only the political leadership, but it's probably going to take a terrible incident. We Americans are completely oblivious until some of us die. That's the lesson of 9/11, and this is what's going to happen. And the Chinese are forcing this because we see increasingly, you served on the destroyer in the South China Sea. In the South China Sea and the East China Sea, there's dangerous Chinese intercepts of our planes and our vessels in the global commons. And some of those have gotten to the point where almost Americans have died. That's what it's going to take.
It's worse than that, though. Let's talk about that. Not about Wall Street getting understand. They fully understand. Corporate America is the lobbying arm for the Chinese Communist Party, and Wall Street is the investor relations department. Okay? Come on. This is the open secret. Bob Davis of the Wall Street Journal had an article 3 or 4 weeks ago about the pressure on President Trump coming from the hedge fund community on Wall Street, telling him, hey, if you don't sign a deal, if we don't sign up the deal to buy $2 trillion the Chinese buy $2 trillion of soybeans, but leave aside any structural changes to the Chinese economy, particularly forced technology transfers and the subsidies of state-owned industries. Because remember, China's greatest export, the CCP's greatest export, is deflation and overcapacity. The reason Japanese industrial production can't get up, Western Europe, the United States, there's so much overcapacity financed by the West that the Chinese have. These people are unregistered foreign agents. And I would respectfully submit if Paul Manafort and Mike Flynn and others on the Russia hoax investigation of President Trump about a nation that is smaller than the economy of New York State and a demographic death spiral that has no technology, they should look at who are the foreign agent representatives unregistered on Wall Street in corporate America that every day bombard the Oval Office with, you have to sign a deal. And don't worry about the structural stuff. We've taken off the table, and I apologize personally to the people in China watching this. We took off the table any mention of the firewall. It can't even be mentioned. It's not even in the trade negotiations. The firewall that enslaves the Chinese people digitally and by information is not even on the table. So I think the way you do it is the American people once again vote a populist economic nationalist like Trump, hold people like Biden accountable, and eventually get the law enforcement apparatus of the Justice Department to look into this.
I mean, the question is, when will American banks get it? And I think we have to all come to realize there are no American banks. They're domiciled here, and our laws protect them. They should be here, but they are beholden to their shareholders. And that's who they report to, profit-driven, as they should be. That's capitalism. But the fact that they're American is incidental, and probably because they need the protection of the United States. But they're beholden to their shareholders, and if that's coming out of China, which it is, they're going to be a political arm for China, and have been.
I would only add that there is a huge disconnect here between fund managers and average Americans who have portfolios. You know, nobody knows what's in their pension systems. I mean, I certainly don't. In other words, it's a long list of companies. It's sort of faceless fund managers that are running those portfolios. And we, the people, have no idea of the nature of the Chinese companies, now that we're on this subject, that are in our respective portfolios. This can be index funds, mutual funds, our public pension systems, and the list goes on. So it's a matter of freedom of speech. It's a matter of information. If we really knew, for example, if the California teachers' pension system actually knew that they were holding Hikvision, which has the surveillance cameras that are incarcerating 1 million Uyghurs in Xinjiang behind barbed wire and walls, I don't think they'd be amused. So if you take that argument, and not to mention on the military and national security side, and the point that Gordon was making, when we have an incident, you know, will that weapon system have been built by AVIC or China Shipbuilding? Gee, I wonder where they are. They're in the MSCI Emerging Market Index. Are they going to be next in the Bloomberg Barclays aggregate bond fund? In other words, it's also moving strongly into Chinese mainland companies. You know, who are these folks? These are the questions we need to be asking, because this is our money. And just to close on one last point that I didn't make, which is the pace of Chinese funds in our market. You know, these indexes, funds are the greatest discovery Beijing could have ever made. I mean, they are one-stop shopping because they send companies viral instantly into every cell of the American body politic. And if you have this pace continue of trillions of dollars of funds moving into American investment portfolios, you could wake up 2 or 3 years from now and realize that 17% or 22% of your retirement system is in Chinese securities. And if that's the case, then you would have taken today's China lobby and made that seem like tinker toys, because you'd have a lobby of well over 100 million Americans. I don't know how many Americans are in the market, but I suspect it gets up more like 200. The point is that if you want to see a lobby, if you want to see the definition of checkmate, it's when they realize that sanctions or penalties of any kind toward China because of its malevolent behavior around the world is going to result in a devaluation of their investment and retirement funds. You're going to see a lobby that doesn't quit, and that's the day that we've allowed this to get completely out of control.
Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Larry Kudlow and others in the administration predicting that a finalized trade agreement is likely soon. You've made it clear that at least most of you are opposed to that agreement, but can you give us some more specifics on what Steve Mnuchin and others who are going to China soon should actually ask for? Give us some changes.
Well, for my part, a bilateral investment treaty that says thou shalt not steal and not go to jail. I mean, I think that would be fair, right? Because if we steal from them, which we have done through the EB-5 program, a pathway to citizenship, there have been times where American fraudsters have stolen from Chinese citizens, and our government has gotten that money back and made those Chinese citizens whole. Because that's what we should do. But they should do the same. And that's a bilateral investment treaty that could make that happen, and we could get our money back.
Yeah, Betsy, I think we have heard that the discussions in Beijing in about a week or so are going to be about enforcement mechanism. And essentially, we have heard that this enforcement mechanism is going to be an established dialogue procedure. In other words, an office in Washington and another office in Beijing where American and Chinese officials will talk to each other. Well, that's just a recipe for stalling. And as Chinese stall, we've seen this in the past. They just steal more U.S. technology, and they engage in further trade predation, and especially the credit card situation where China promised access to American credit card companies by 2006. Today, no U.S. credit card company has issued its own card in China. That's the question of stalling. There is some talk about how China will promise not to retaliate if we issue some sort of cost for China violating a trade deal. So China violates the trade deal, we impose some costs, China agrees not to retaliate. That's just fantasy land. I mean, I don't understand how that's enforceable. The only thing that's going to be enforceable is a tariff which is not 25%, but 250%. We have to impose the costs that are higher than the benefits China gets from stealing U.S. technology. And whatever that number is, that's what we need to do in terms of tariffs and other costs.
President Trump reiterated this in the State of the Union when he said, I will bring structural changes to the relationship we have with the Chinese economy, not just some deal that buys $2 trillion worth of soybeans. Those 6 verticals, that is the fundamental restructuring of the Chinese economy. This is not a trade deal. It's not a trade negotiation. This is an armistice on an economic war that the Chinese Communist Party, the radical cadre, has run against the industrial democracies for 20 years. This is an armistice. In that armistice, the 2 central points, Gordon's exactly correct. If we do what's been written in the paper, that's nothing more than the Clinton, Bush, Obama strategic economic dialogue. That's just going to tap us along as they continue to do it. You have to have monitoring. The key is monitoring. Real-time monitoring and then execution and punitive tariffs tariffs that stay on, and then tariffs that really launch off of anything that monitoring shows you. Of the 6 verticals, which are, forced technology transfer, intellectual property theft, cyber intrusion, currency manipulation, non-trade barriers, and subsidies to state-owned industries. The 2 keys are forced technology transfer and subsidies to state-owned industries. Until we get a monitoring, it's what David Goldman said. That their economic model is radically different. They look at themselves as the center of a manufacturing empire that One Belt, One Road consolidates on the Eurasian landmass through sub-Saharan Africa to the Caribbean and Latin America. Made in China 2025 leapfrogs us with AI, robotics, and artificial intelligence, and software and chip design. And then Huawei rolls out 5G, which takes quantum computing to the next level. That all has to be in here. Can it get done in the next couple of weeks? Absolutely not. But that's why this is an armistice. And you have someone like Bob Lighthizer, the partner of Skadden Arps, who's at the tip of the spear of this, and Peter Navarro. If their voices are heard and Lighthizer's allowed to get this deal, it's one of the reasons I believe that Prime Minister Abe is coming on a short trip and a turnaround this weekend in the White House. Not just with the Japanese deal. I think it's to raise the alarm about what a non-structural deal with China could hold.
Very briefly, I'm less worried about Chinese stealing our technology than American companies lining up to give it away to them, per Steve's point about the 5th column in the United States. I think we need radical export controls that prevent Boeing from selling satellites to China, as the Wall Street Journal reported earlier this week, that are used for surveillance, preventing Intel from creating a research center in China which advances Chinese skills and so forth. So I think putting our own house in order would be an urgent thing to do. In terms of large tariffs, we've got a simple problem. We don't produce this stuff anymore. Our biggest imports from China are smartphones, computers, tablets, and so forth. If we put on huge tariffs across the board, Americans will start paying a lot more for those products, and in that case, there might be a reaction. President Trump might not be reelected. So I agree with Steve. This is an armistice. We're not going to win everything in this round. We have to gauge profit and loss, benefit and cost, and move on to the strategically decisive things which are going to win the long war.
Let me take this gentleman right here, the bow tie. Stand by for a microphone. Identify yourself, please.
John French. Nobody has made any comments on the question of all the gold that China is squirreling away. What is your view if the Chinese at some point decide to back the yuan with gold and turn it into the reserve currency of the world, which would be very bad for us?
You can't turn your currency into a reserve currency. Would you put your checking account in RMB? I wouldn't. Everyone wants it in dollars, including the Chinese. Now, the Chinese are going to bribe our financial industry by giving them big franchises in China. UBS has already gotten a bank license. Allianz Insurance has already gotten an insurance license. JP Morgan will definitely be in there. All of the investment companies, BlackRock will be in there. And at that point, they hope over perhaps 10 years to develop a capital market sufficiently integrated with the West that would allow them to develop a reserve currency. So, we should be careful about what we wish for. There are some aspects of Chinese transparency which act as a bribe to our corporate sector and advance their own agenda in the long term.
I'd like to add something to that. When you look at the money supply in China, if you look at Chinese M2 at the end of last year hit, I'm going to use dollars, hit $32 trillion on an economy of 12. Okay? They've printed more money than anyone ever has. Think about the U.S. debate is whether or not the Fed's balance sheet is incredibly too large at somewhere between 3 and 3.5 trillion. The Chinese have printed $32 trillion worth of their currency domestically, and they've held the price levels down on everything but real estate. And so, look, if they ever open their capital account, I don't know how many rich Chinese people that can't wait to buy more Chinese real estate and send their kids to school in China. But what's going to happen is the currency would immediately suffer a massive devaluation. So this idea of somehow finding first of all, the amount of gold ever mined in world history to date is about 7 trillion, and a lot of it's been used in industrial applications, some of it's been used for dowry and jewelry. But they have $32 trillion worth of currency today, and they're growing at 3 or 4 trillion a year. There isn't enough gold in the world to index to some hard asset.
Good. Let's take this lady right here.
Thank you. My name is Loretta Hennessy. My question is, why are we not, and how can we, leverage the relationship with Japan to exert more pressure and to collaborate more clearly with them? They're our friends.
Well, I think it's a matter of an uncertain trumpet. The Japanese and the South Koreans are massive investors in Southeast Asia and elsewhere in the world. Japan has more foreign assets than China does. And they certainly have the capacity to export technology. If we united with them, India and other countries, to create our own Belt and Road Initiative and pursue it seriously, I think we could chop up China's efforts in most of the world. We could do it much more effectively, particularly Southeast Asia, which is China's backyard and doesn't like doing business with the Chinese because they know them. So I think the answer is the Japanese have looked at us prevaricate, pivot to Asia, as Steve was saying, you know, that's one Marine Brigade in Darwin, Australia, and wondering whether we're serious enough about it. They've got to live next to China, and if China's going to end up being the more powerful player because we failed, then they'll have to make an accommodation. If they're convinced that we're determined to win, I don't think we'll have a problem bringing them to our side.
Just a word about the Japanese. I've been going for over 40 years and have relationships there today. Do you know how many Chinese companies are in the Japanese stock exchange? I think the last count was 4, compared to our over 650, in part because that's the rigor of their disclosure requirements, the rigor of what it takes to get onto their market, versus the free lunch program that largely exists here, particularly in the OTC, the over-the-counter market. So this business about rigor and disclosure and transparency is essential. The Japanese fully appreciate the granularity of much of what I was talking about today. They're looking at troubled Chinese transactions around the world. Those Belt and Road Initiative projects that never came to fruition had safety problems, quality control, not just corruption and human rights and national security implications, but all manner of problems that have ensued. They are competing with a rigged system, but through exposing the Chinese for what they're really up to, which has been such a powerful theme this morning. So I think the Japanese are further ahead in terms of this kind of scrutiny and demand-oriented performance on the part of China than we are by a good bit. We have a lot to learn from them, but one thing for sure is they are at our side, particularly with Prime Minister Abe. I don't see any daylight between Japan and the United States today.
I think suffice it to say they get that there's a present danger in the neighborhood. Yes, sir.
I'm David Braunschweig. I have one word and 2 questions. The one word that I haven't heard much today is Taiwan. The 2 questions are, what is the likelihood and the timing of China enacting its one country, 2 systems with China, meaning with Taiwan, meaning invading Taiwan? And the second question is, what would America do about it?
Those are absolutely critical questions because for us, Taiwan is in the center of our Western defense perimeter. You know, we've drawn our Western defense perimeter not off of California or even Guam, but off the coast of Asia. Xi Jinping has been talking with increasing frequency about forceful measures to take Taiwan. And some people have said that he's even set a deadline of 2020, which I don't think that he's done. But nonetheless, as you see internal distress inside of China, the idea of taking over Taiwan by force if necessary becomes much more attractive to Xi Jinping, who is in a political position where he's put himself in a point where he's in jeopardy because he has deinstitutionalized the Communist Party, created a lot of enemies. And so misadventure abroad actually makes quite some sense for him politically. So I think that we've got to understand that we're facing a question not just 10 or 15 years down the road, but facing a question in the next couple of years. As to the point of what the United States will do, that's always been very difficult for others to understand. You know, Dean Acheson in 1950 put South Korea outside of the U.S. defense perimeter, and what did we do? We defended it, despite what he said. April Glaspie, the American ambassador to Iraq, told Saddam Hussein just 8 days before he invaded Kuwait that the United States wasn't going to be concerned about what she called intra-Arab disputes. What did we do? We defended Kuwait. I think that, unfortunately, we may have the same situation where we leave in the minds of the Chinese that we are not going to do anything, and that then, when something does occur, we are forced to respond. And that's the reason why the Committee on Present Danger is so important, is to marshal American will so that Xi Jinping never thinks that he can use force against any of his neighbors, including Taiwan.
Hong Kong, South Korea, Japan, and especially Taiwan are absolutely essential. The 2020 election season, before we even get to Iowa, we start with, I think, a more important election. That's Taiwan. And just this week, the mayor of, was it Kaohsiung Han, who has very close relationships with the CCP, dropped out, I think, yesterday for the KMT primary because Terry Guo of Foxconn, you know, is now running. He got inspired by the goddess Mazu last week and said he's going to run for the KMT against either President Tsai or William Lei, one of the two candidates of the DPP. Or the DPP is all about independence, all about a relationship and partnership with the United States. And I think we have to ask the question, just like we have to ask Joe Biden and his family, what is your relationship with Chinese financial institutions? What is your relationship with senior members of the CCP? What were you doing in 2013 on Air Force Two with your son at the same time you were allowing, as Vice President of the United States, China to build these islands, these stationary aircraft carriers, because that's what they are, in the South China Sea, and basically had the biggest give up of the West since Munich? We have to ask Terry Go the exact same question, because they're not going to need to invade. They could do this through the ballot box, and they could do this through a massive influence operation that is going on in Taiwan right now. And Terry Go of Foxconn, to me, has to answer the same questions. What is your relationship with the CCP? What financing have you gotten from the CCP? What do you have in mainland China? How does it operate with the CCP? And the people of Taiwan, I think, are owed those answers. And this campaign in 2020 for the presidency of Taiwan is going to be the kickoff to the presidential campaign of 2020 in the United States, because China, and the issue of China and the West, in particular the relationship of the United States and China, to me, is going to be the single most important topic that's discussed. Not wellness, not positivity, not mindfulness, not all these things that the Democrats are talking about today, but the hard reality of geopolitics.
Take a couple more. Yes, sir. Right here.
Thanks. Just to follow up, my name is Brian McCarthy. I'll follow up on a couple of the financial issues that have come up. I think Mr. Bannon called Wall Street the Investor Relations Department for China. as a big consumer of Wall Street research on China, it often struck me you'd get a research from 4 or 5 banks saying the exact same thing each morning. The chief China economist of all the big global banks is called into the PBOC once a quarter, and they are literally giving talking points. So investor relations is a nice way to put it. They're quite literally an extension of the Chinese propaganda effort. And my question would be on that one is, where's the SEC on this? Secondly, very refreshing to hear the commentary on the MSCI and Bloomberg Barclays bond index, which is even bigger, this index inclusion. This sounds like a bit of esoterica, but this is actually a really critical strategy for China to survive the next 3 or 4 years. China is desperate for dollars. As Mr. Bass has mentioned, the Chinese populace is just lined up to get money out of China. Every dollar that comes in, someone's ready to take it down and get it out. So, you're talking hundreds of billions of dollars being forced into China, into markets that, because of the fact that Chinese people cannot get out, are by definition overvalued and at a disequilibrium. So where are the pension regulators and others who are supposed to be keeping an eye on the fiduciary responsibility that these index providers have to their clients and the ultimate beneficiaries?
Before Kyle jumps in, we're going to sign you up. This is why we formed the committee, to give people like you a platform to have this anguish you've had for the last number of years of what's going on here. Wall Street is the propaganda department of the CCP.
Your question is perfect. When you look at across the Wall Street banks and you look at the joint ventures that even the U.S. banks have with the Asian banks, the figureheads atop of those JVs are all members of the Chinese Communist Party. There should be some Reg FD disclosure out there, just like there is on analysts owning something. If you're going to read a piece of research, it should say, the vice chairman of the bank is a member of the CCP, and he actually edited this report, because it happens. And when we talk with chief economists about the very specific issues we talk about across Asia, I know some of them very well personally. They'll call me and they'll say, this is the real deficit, this is the augmented deficit. And I said, well, why don't you put that in your report? He says, well, they would never let that get printed in the report. And I said, but you are Bank XYZ here in the United States. He says, yeah, but our chairman in Asia is a CCP member, and it wouldn't make it through the edit. And it literally happens all the time. So I think Reg FD disclosures about Communist Party membership are absolutely necessary.
Okay. Last question. Yes, sir. Right over here.
Sorry, speaking of those banks, John Cheeseman, HSBC. I guess comment something that is also missing from the trade talks is on the human rights side in China, and probably something that the U.S. should have a interest in. The second observation is how we invest as passive investors, through our 401k accounts. It does mean that right now money is just flowing exactly where these indices say. But it also means there's a great opportunity in this where people do have, it would be quite easy to have control over where your pension money does go. I did some work with an organization called Just Capital here in the US. Now, they rank US corporations by ethical standards, and there's a variety of them. And it's so far, it's actually pretty, unfortunately, it's pretty unsuccessful. People don't seem to care how ethical, where their money's going. And I was just wondering what organizations you feel are educating investors about the human rights atrocities that are happening across China, and how successful you think that will be.
Let me take a quick cut at that. It's one of the reasons, as Steve was just saying, that this new Committee on the Present Danger has been formed. We've focused here today, for obvious reasons, with this audience on the economic warfare piece of what the Chinese are doing. On the 2nd of May in Washington, we're going to have the second of our roundtable discussions there. In the last one of the featured presentations was from a Uyghur, talking about the concentration camps and what's happening to his people, but also making the broader point that there is a war on faith being mounted by the Chinese Communist Party. We will also be discussing a number of issues that we just didn't get to today, including what the Chinese are doing in space and the mortal threat that poses to us, both in terms of our economy and in terms of our national security. The military buildup, we haven't really touched on that at all today. Information warfare, we've gotten a little bit into that, but we'll do so much more on the second. We've talked about a bit the South China Sea, the issue of 5G. I had hoped we were going to spend some time talking to you about it because this is an existential threat. Make no mistake about it, in the near term, if it turns out that it's a Chinese-owned and operated network, not one in which we are, in fact, in control of the system for everything from data management and Internet of Things to actually your personal safety. God help us if that's in the hands of the Chinese. So I think unless anyone has anything else they wanted to add, we will wrap it with this further note. Please continue to consult presentdangerchina.org as a resource. We will try to keep you apprised of what we're doing. We're interested in the sorts of things that might help you make better decisions about what you're doing, specifically with respect to the case that's been made here, that we are enabling the present danger from China with our financial support and other investments and technology transfers, willing and unwilling. That must stop. And so must we. Thank you very much for being with us. Thank you to this great panel.